you start by giving us the background and the context to the seminar today, where it belongs in the course and what you were trying to achieve with this particular session?
Sure. So we're now in semester 2, and we have a long module that's been split up into semester 1 and semester 2 called Contemporary Literature in a Global Context. So in semester 1 we kind of set up some of the kind of theoretical interests of the module and go through a range of texts, and essentially in semester 2 we kind of continue where we left off, looking at a range of contemporary texts that key into various kind of contemporary issues or issues around post-colonialism, gender, nationhood, as we were talking about today. Today's session on Amy Tan, the Bonesetter's daughter, is in week 2 of 11 weeks of semester 2, and so was again kind of picking up some of the issues around nationhood using the Benedict Anderson that we'd already kind of dealt with to some degree last semester, but was also kind of trying to focus that through this particular text that we were encountering for the first time.
Okay, great. Do you think how well do you think it went? Did you do what you were intending to do?
Yeah, I think it went quite well. They talked, which was good, and I think I probably perhaps could have set up the link between the two different activities a bit better, thinking about it. I wasn't sure that they all sort of quite kind of got the sense that they wanted to. I wanted to connect the different metaphors that they were dealing with this issue of nationhood. I
was wondering about that. You started off by giving them quite a complicated theoretical bit of theory about what nationhood is, and then split them into groups and asked them to discuss that in relation to images from the novel, and gave them a list of images. Is that the sort of structure you normally use? You split them, you give the material, split them into groups. Is that a common strategy?
Sometimes, I mean, I try to kind of mix it up. So sometimes I'll sort of move around the furniture, and we'll all sit in a big sort of horseshoe or circle, and just kind of have a class discussion for 50 minutes. Sometimes that doesn't work so well. Sometimes I find it's better to kind of give them smaller activities to break up the time and kind of ask them to think about something for 2 minutes, 5 minutes in a pair or a group, and then come back. So that is a strategy I use a fair amount.
So why did you have this particular structure for this particular seminar?
I suppose I wanted to, first of all, pick up on some of the ideas that were talked about in the lecture that they'd had a few days earlier, and nationhood was a key concept there, and I wanted to kind of pin some of those ideas down a bit further by using a particular theorist, a particular extract, but then also kind of use that theoretical kind of angle to hopefully highlight some different ways of reading some of the metaphors and images of the text. Whether that worked as I exactly wanted it to, I'm not sure, but I think there was a degree of success.
So how would you analyse the way that it worked as the seminar went from one element to another? Because the tricky bits in a way are the transitions between from one thing to another, and I often think the trickiest is the transition back out to the whole seminar at the end. Yeah,
I think that's probably right, because I don't know, there is a sense of, if I've gone around and spoken to each group and already heard what they've said, do we need to have the kind of plenary bit at the end where everybody tells everybody everything else, if that's kind of just rehearsing what they've already done? But I mean, it didn't happen so much with this group, but in other groups, other people chime in other people's sections and kind of add to and build on when they're reporting back. And I kind of like it when that happens, because it feels like the whole reporting back element is kind of a bit more interesting. but it doesn't always happen like that.
But you did mix it up quite a lot, didn't you? It wasn't a mechanical sort of going around first one group, then another group. It didn't have that sort of feeling of a slog that it sometimes has.
Yeah, I mean, I also knew that several groups were sort of thinking about the same sort of sets of images, and so could build on what the previous group had been saying. So that seemed like a structure that would work.
What advantages do you think there are to breaking the students up into groups like that and getting them to work for that short period by themselves?
I think that it can be really useful in getting students to talk. Perhaps shy students who wouldn't be very happy or comfortable with kind of just putting themselves out there in front of the whole group. I think it can give them a chance to kind of get across some ideas, start thinking in a sort of comfortable position with their friend or with a small group. So I think that's one of the good things about it. And one of the bad things about it is that sometimes they don't always talk about what you want them to talk about in their small groups, and they talk about what they were doing last night or whatever. So I was kind of trying to have half an ear to the other groups whilst I was talking to each one, to sort of make sure that they were on track. But it can be difficult to police, or not police, that's probably the wrong word. It can be difficult to control.
Do you set them specific work to prepare for the seminar outside, in between the seminars?
I did last semester with this group, and I do with my level 3 group. This semester I'm experimenting with not setting them preparation. Apart from reading the primary text and attending the lecture. And what I'm doing is, the reason I'm experimenting with this is because the preparation that I set last semester was often not done. And building a seminar on the premise of preparation that you think the students will do and then doesn't get done, I found quite problematic. So my new strategy is to not ask them to prepare by reading a particular chapter from a critical text or whatever. What I might do from week to week is put on ULearn a kind of preparation sheet which says, think about these questions as you're reading the primary text, and then use that in the seminar. And that kind of gives them a bit more freedom. And then I will say, if this is something that you're interested in, you can see, maybe you want to read this particular article or this particular chapter. And I think that, because this is my first year, I'm kind of evaluating how it's going as I go along. Because in the past I have always set extra reading as well as the primary reading. But I'm experimenting with how it goes without doing that, and I'm kind of relying on the students to do as much critical reading and reading around the primary material as they want.
But perhaps that's part of the reason why you gave them a bit of a theoretical text today.
Yeah, and I think that's something that I will probably do again, because instead of giving them a preparation sheet asking them to read X, Y and Z, essentially I'm bringing the preparation sheet and some of the work already kind of done to the seminar. And how that works, I'm still in the process of kind of deciding. But we'll see what the feedback's like in comparison with last semester and this semester.
You referred to the lecture a couple of times in the seminar. Can you say something in general about the way that lectures and seminars on the same course should work together?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think sometimes they don't, and sometimes it's tricky, particularly if you're teaching on a really big course that you might not attend the lectures, and you might not have any kind of knowledge of whether the students were attending the lectures, and that can be difficult. But we, the people lecturing on this particular module, put their lecture slides up on ULearn, and Marion, who gave the lecture this week, also puts a kind of mini version of the lecture in a Word document up on ULearn before the lecture itself. So the students, have this material, and I think I do kind of like to try and connect the lecture with the seminar and try to kind of pick up on one of the ideas or kind of use it in some way. Hopefully, they'll also show that they've been to the lecture, and that, it shows that the lecture and the seminar are supposed to work together and are part of the same module, and are kind of two different ways of dealing with the text that are related.
Can you tell us something about the nature of the assessment for this course and how you plan the seminar to be effective in preparing the students for the assessment?
So the assessment's in two parts. The first part, which I kind of briefly mentioned at the end of the seminar, is a comparative essay, and that's 2,000 words and due in the end of March, so week 8 I think, and we're now in week 2. And as I was saying, I've put the questions on ULearn for them, and I'll be talking about it with them in more detail next week. But I was kind of trying, also at the end of the seminar, trying to get them to start thinking about connections they might be making. So I was saying, about the framing of the Amy Tan narrative in comparison to the way that the Life of Pi is framed in a similar way. And then kind of asking them to sort of start thinking about connections they might make between the Tan text and the Doris Pilkington that we're going to be looking at next week, which, in many ways there are lots of connections you could make between those two texts. So that's part of asking them to start thinking comparatively. The other part of the assessment is an exam, and the exam has two components. One is a close reading of an extract from one of the texts, and the other is an essay question. And hopefully, they've already done an exam like this for the kind of previous version of this module. But I will also, as we go through, I'll kind of ask them to look closely at a chunk of the primary text. We didn't do that so much today, but it's something I do quite like to do, kind of read a paragraph and deal with it carefully and unpack it. And I didn't really do it with the primary text because we'd already kind of used that strategy with the Anderson extract. But I do want them to kind of look through the text as they're looking for examples and as they're talking in their groups. And some of them did that and some of them less so. I think because some of them were more familiar with the text and some of them less so.
When you're doing that sort of analysis of a bit of text, do you think it's important that you write something up, that you diagram it in the way that you did, because that was a striking part of your seminar?
Yeah, I don't always do that, but I think it can be useful to kind of have some sort of visual for the students, some way of kind of giving them a summary or a spider diagram or whatever. And I guess, maybe it's also kind of helpful for them to get their ideas kind of written down. And they do take notes, or at least some of them do, whether or not you use the board or whiteboard or blackboard or whatever. But I think it can be a useful tool, although I don't use it all the time. Sometimes also kind of giving them the kind of wodge of paper back there, sometimes giving them pens and paper and asking them to do a diagram or a list or whatever can be useful.
Would you ever use new technology of some sort, like PowerPoint or something like that, to perform any of that function, or for any other reason in a seminar?
I haven't yet. That's not to say I wouldn't. Perhaps showing a film clip would be something that I might use in a seminar, and then kind of relate that to the text or analyse it or compare and contrast between film and text. and actually lots of the teaching rooms are sort of equipped and have screens and laptops and all the rest of it. So it's something that I could do, but it's something that I haven't done yet.
Yes. That was quite a sort of highly structured, quite direct. The activities were quite sort of focused and directed. You were asking students to think about particular aspects of the text.
Mm-hmm.
You're trying to strike a balance between giving them all the answers yourself and getting them to think of their own ideas. Do you want to talk about that sort of relationship, that sort of balance?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's a difficult balance to strike. And I did kind of wonder whether I should, I had the little list of ideas on the handout, or images or whatever on the handout, and I did kind of wonder whether I should put them there, and whether that would kind of limit them to those ideas. And perhaps for some of the students it did, but for others, one of the groups started thinking about food as the kind of one of the sort of recurrent sets of images or metaphors. So I think some of them were able to sort of, use that structure but go beyond it. It is a difficult balance, and it is something that I kind of am aware of, and perhaps in my teaching, that because I'm worried about silences and I'm worried about the students kind of floundering, then perhaps I do structure more than I need to, because that feels like a bit of a safety net. If there's something written on the paper, there's something that I can kind of point to and use.
On the other hand, there is that part in the seminar when you're completely withdrawn from the group, so that they have their own opportunity to talk. How do you think they think of seminars? Do your students enjoy seminars? Are they natural seminar creatures?
That group are quite good. I think they, if not enjoy, then kind of appreciate to some degree that seminars are important and that they are part of why they're here, a really significant part of why they're here. Other groups, I think, that I teach, and it really depends upon the kind of dynamic of the personalities in the group, but other groups are quieter and are perhaps more difficult to elicit a kind of dynamic and natural sounding conversation from. So I think it can be, so the seminar can be a really good thing, but it can also fall flat. But I mean, in general, they're used to the seminar. They're used to the idea of kind of contributing. So they know, they feel the difference between a seminar and a lecture. And in a lecture, you can sort of get away with not doing that much and being relatively passive. But in a seminar, you have to say something. Although I kind of made the classic mistake of asking people is there anything else you'd like to contribute? And obviously they can just say no. And this is I need to think of other strategies to get them not to say no.
It was okay though, wasn't it? Because the whole atmosphere was so friendly. It felt that anybody could say anything and nobody would mind. There was that moment when one of the students just referred to a bit of the text that she just remembered that didn't have a point to make about it, but just wanted to say that. I thought that was quite a nice, nice phenomenon.
I mean, that it is something that I kind of try to do to make it a friendly atmosphere, to kind of not, not kind of make students feel that they're kind of being put down if they make a point that's not really a point, or if they repeat something that somebody else has just said. Because I'd rather they were saying things, and I'd rather that kind of built up naturally into a kind of conversation that can be a productive one if it's a kind of more relaxed atmosphere.
So how do you deal with it when a student says something that is a mistake or doesn't make sense?
I suppose I sort of did it with Nick, one of the students who was making a point about the Anderson, but I wasn't really clear what he was saying. So I kind of did a little summary of what I thought he was saying, and then asked him again to clarify. And I think that sort of clarified, but his point was still a bit confused.
It was about modularity, wasn't it?
It was about modularity, which is probably quite a difficult concept to get over in a minute or 30 seconds. So he was probably doing the best he could. But I think you can then kind of ask other students to sort of build on that or refine it yourself. When you write it on the board, you can say, and we'll summarise that like this.
Yes. What is your strategy for dealing with quiet students or eliciting participation from quiet students?
Well, what have you got to contribute, or can you contribute, didn't really work. But I think part of the sort of breaking the group up into small groups is a way of dealing with quiet students, a way of getting quiet students to talk. I did used to kind of put students on the spot more than I do. And I don't do it so much anymore. I don't kind of randomly pick students so much and say, what do you think about this? Because I can see the fear in their eyes, and I can sympathise that can be quite an uncomfortable situation to be in. On the other hand, it can be quite frustrating, and it can be quite difficult to kind of gauge whether they've done any preparation for the seminar or read the book if they're not willing to contribute. So by going around and talking to the little groups, that can be a way of, actually assessing whether the quiet people have done the work, because you can then say, more directly, you can have a one-to-one with them and sort of get a sense of whether they have been working and whether they're shy, but it's not really an issue because they're working, they're taking it in, they're being productive, or whether they're shy because they're not working at all.
What about the reverse? What about dealing with very overconfident students, very dominant students?
Yeah, I mean, this group does have some confident characters in it, and I mean, lots of groups do, and I think it can be tricky. I think one way of coping with it is to kind of be structured and to kind of use that structure to distribute the conversation around the group. But I also, I mean, I try not to kind of silence a student in a way that they're going to take umbrage against, because I do want them to talk and I want them to kind of be opinionated.
What sort of student were you in seminars? And do you think back to your experience when you're planning what to do in your teaching?
I probably do. I was the student who was not particularly brilliant, but didn't like uncomfortable silences, so would just say something to fill the silence. And that point might be kind of really boring or redundant even, but I would have said something which made me feel better about the group. So does that? But now I'm more tolerant of silence. I think a bit more tolerant of silence. I think I still do jump in more than I probably could do, and I think when a student's made a point, I will quite often kind of say, yeah, interesting, and then sort of say something else. And I thought, like, I have been aware at different times in different seminars of, if I just leave a little bit longer, does another student then make that point or build on that point? And I think that's something I probably don't do as much as I could do, because I do have this tendency to need to fill a silence.
Are there types of seminar structure that you want to experiment with, that you've thought about, haven't quite got on to putting into practice yet?
I mean, there's the whole kind of using technology, which I've thought about but not put into practice yet. Whether that be kind of using a PowerPoint and kind of having the student give a little mini lecture with PowerPoint or whatever, or whether that be using a clip of a film. I think that could be really interesting and useful, and I haven't got to that yet. But yeah, I mean, I think the use of technology in the classroom is something that I'm sure will be more and more of an issue. So I think it's something that I need to start thinking about.
Have you sat in on your colleagues' seminars, and have you learned from that?
I have, yes. Several people's over the past kind of few years. Well, 3 or 4 people's seminars, and they were really interesting. And I was very impressed by one of my colleagues at a previous university who had a group of about 10 students, and who was sitting in her office with them, and who managed to have just a lovely conversation with them for an hour, and kind of, you know, the conversation went between the students as much as it did between her and the students, and I was very impressed and jealous of her ability to do that, or to elicit that kind of natural kind of feeling.
Is there anything you can do to replicate that? It almost sounds as if you're saying that's just a magical quality that she has.
It did seem magical at the time. She was very, very good at. I think she was somebody who had a higher tolerance for silence than I did, and would sort of allow more of a gap, and allow one student to kind of take over what another student had said, rather than kind of feeling that she needed to reassure the student that that point was good and well made, and you could think this about it as well. So maybe that's what I learnt from her seminar, or one of the things I learnt from her seminar. And I mean, yeah, I've also seen observed postgraduate students teaching, and remember observing a very, very nervous postgraduate student who was very. I think it was almost her first seminar ever, and she was really anxious and really worried about it. But it was interesting to see that the students were fine with it and were really patient with her, and it didn't seem to matter to them, and they wanted to contribute, and they wanted to sort of make it a good seminar, and that was kind of a nice experience.
Finally, if you had just 3 tips that you could give to a colleague about, perhaps a new colleague, about seminars, what would they be?
I would say, I haven't prepared this in advance. I would say, don't be too nervous. The students will probably be nice. I would say, use the text, use the primary text, get the students to crack the spine and annotate. And I would say that, what else would I say? That it's a good idea to try and create a friendly, relaxed atmosphere if you can.
Great.